Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Dignity, Development, and Women's Rights panel, moderated by Dr. Jamie Lemke.
Hello. Welcome. Good afternoon to everybody here in person and also the 200 or so online. I'm Jamie Lemke. I'm a senior fellow with the Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I've worked at many Atlas Network organizations over the years, but never been here with you all in person, so it's a real pleasure. And it's also my pleasure to introduce today this discussion of a very important issue that affects us all, the denial of economic rights, political rights, and other basic human rights to women around the world, and in nearly every society's history, affects us all greatly. So it's really a pleasure to have these distinguished panelists here with us today to discuss this issue. I'll briefly introduce them and then we'll dive right in. First, at the end, we have Baishali Bomjan, founder director of the Treyas Foundation, which provides research-based advisory to governments and civil society in India. She's also on the board of Afghanistan Economic and Legal Studies Organization and is a strategy advisor to the Center for Indonesia Policy Studies. Isabella Patriota is a member of the leadership team of Lola Brazil and director of development for Lola in the US. She's also policy director in a liberty-minded Brazilian nonprofit before joining Lola. Finally, Fatima Massi is the director of the Inclusive Society area at the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, where she supervises applied analysis to identify barriers that prevent women from entering, remaining, and growing in the labor market. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so it's always a good place to start to motivate why we should care about these questions. So what I'd like to ask all of you is why women? In other words, why direct our attention and our energy towards women's issues specifically rather than issues of rights in general? Baishali, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Jamie. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Atlas Network. This is a very special moment for me, especially because not just attending a live event after 2 years, but also representing for the first time my own foundation. So very, very glad to be here. But coming back to your question, Jamie, why women, right? Well, Jamie, women's rights are human rights. And I come from India. Now, India is home to 1.38 billion people, and women comprise 48% of our population, right? Statistics show that despite growing economy, better educational outcomes, lower fertility rates over time, right? Participation of women in the Indian economy is abysmally low and declining. So it was some 33% in the 1970s, 26% in the 1990s, and today we are at an 18%, 3 times lower than for men. So you can imagine even our labor force participation rates is probably the lowest in the world, one of the lowest in the world, with only parts of the Arab world lesser than us, right? So for us, this curious case of the Indian working women was a big puzzle, and I think Treyas wanted to help answer that question of why isn't Indian women participating in the economy, right? And it was only natural for a women-founded, women-led organization that we really pay attention to what's happening to this 500 million women in our country, and why aren't they participating in the economy? And I hope that helps answer your question. We didn't really decide on getting into this at first go, simply because we were a women-founded organization, but statistics were glaringly there for us, and that's why we're here.
So it was not only personal for you, but you also recognized a big missed opportunity Absolutely. In the policy area. Yeah. Thank you. Isabella, would you like to add?
Yes. Thank you for having me here, too. That's a pleasure to be here talking for the first time in Liberty Forum. I'm coming from Brazil, so I have something similar to what Baishali experiences in India. We are half of the population, we are half of the workforce, and we still face some barriers preventing us to progress. And some of them come from the government, but some of them come from the society too. And we need to address what is preventing us to progress. And if we think in nowadays world, women can see, they can compare their lives in Brazil with their lives in the northern countries, with the life here in the US, so they can compare how free they are and how free they can get. And if they can compare, they can address solutions for what is preventing them to be free. And sometimes they're gonna find solutions that not necessarily are going to address those problems. And if we want them to be on our side, we need to explain. Many times we need to make it clear that it doesn't matter if a policy, how you think about a policy. What matters is the result. So many times that's why women are not on our side, they're not on the liberty side, because we are not talking to them. The liberty movement and classic liberal ideas are not as approachable to them as different other thoughts are being approachable to them. So that's why I think talking about women being in a women organization is important.
That's interesting. That disconnect, I think, is definitely something we should come back to when we talk more about what Lola has going on. First of all, why women?
So, well, first of all, hello everyone, especially those that are looking at us at home. I'm so excited that I'm here sharing this space with these important women. And I agree with what Vaishali and Isabella have said. There are historical gaps and disadvantages that have faced women that prevents them or make it more difficult for them to be freer and to enter the workforce and to enjoy the same conditions as other workers. So in Mexico, we have a similar situation like the one in India, where women are a little bit past half the population in general, but only 39% of the workforce. And still there are many barriers, invisible barriers, because we don't have like legal restrictions that prevent women from entering the workforce and growing within the labor market. So what we do at the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness is actually understanding and identifying those invisible barriers that better to create those policies and actions that would probably break those barriers and let more women enter, remain, and grow in the labor market. And basically, and there's one little thing that probably I want to get into it a little later, but the thing is, we shouldn't be watching or looking at how we bring more women into the labor force as a social responsibility action. Everybody, the market, the firms, the organizations, everybody gains from this more diversity as we add more diversity into the labor force and we analyze problems and solutions with a myriad of views, everybody wins. The thing is that everybody has to make changes so that we can actually have this more diverse labor force.
That point that everybody wins, I think, is such an important one. That's something economists have been talking about since Adam Smith and his observations about the extent of the market and only really being able to benefit from specialization in trade when we really expand and open up our markets, and limiting women from participating just cuts off gains, cuts off economic growth. Right. Some of those barriers you mentioned are invisible. Some of them are very visible. So I'm interested now, let's take a little time to talk about the work each of you are doing to address those visible and invisible barriers. Vaishali, what are some of the barriers that you see as most critical? What's holding back women in India?
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer, but what we've seen at Trias and what we've been studying is there are many, many legacy laws that restrict women's participation in the economy, right? Some put entry barriers for women job seekers, others put a premium on hiring women, and some in indirect manner also restrict women from starting, operating, and growing a business of sorts, right? So as a first step, what we at Trias started to do was really study law by law, regulation after regulation, subordinate legislations to count and catalog every instance in which there is legal discrimination or economic discrimination of women job seekers that is sanctioned by law. So we studied about 50 legislation and 150 subordinate legislations across 24, 25 states in India, and started seeing these patterns of discrimination and variations across state levels, right? And then as a next step, it was really analyzing this problem from a couple of questions. So what are 4 different parameters, right? Taking women's freedom in terms of working in night shifts, freedom of women to work in jobs that are that seems dangerous, that seems arduous, that seems morally inappropriate, right? And that's the first step, and I hope the results of the study will give state governments in India a ready reckoner of reforms to really meet what they've already committed to do, Jamie. I mean, they are part of the UN Sustainable Goals. They've committed to the Beijing Action for Reforms, right? And therefore, the whole approach for us is how can we assist state governments or governments in India to meet what they've already committed to do? And how can we provide them with this ready reckoner of things that they can do today, right? To kind of really open up or really free women from entering the job market. So that's a little bit for you. I'll get into some of the details later on.
Yeah, and these limitations on women entering the job market, these happen in many countries around the world. You're doing this really interesting comparative case by looking at the differences in the Indian states. And, comparative study can be a really interesting way to learn about which policies are more and less effective. What are you learning about the impact that denying the ability to be employed on your own terms is having on women and on business in India?
Well, India is a country with 28 states, right? So it's really complicated to kind of give you a simple answer to that, but I can put something in context. So suppose this room is India, right? And I don't know where Brad is, but Brad's table is the central government or the union government, and the remaining 28 tables are like state governments, right? Well, Brad would one day kind of get up and say, women are not allowed to work in night shifts. So nothing beyond 7 p.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning. Well, most of the tables would be quiet on it, but like maybe somebody from table 9 will stand up and say, hey, in our states, there may be permitted to kind of work at night, but they would require a special permission on a case-by-case basis, right? Or a second table would kind of get up and say, hey, we want to give a blanket exemption to a certain industry of sorts, but which is renewable year after year after year, which means that the onus really lies with the state to give that freedom or not give that freedom, right? So that's just one example. Or in another case, it would be as simple as Brad's table, the central government says women can't, say for example, if we tell this audience that women on each of the table can't really work in events, simply because in Atlas events, there are lots of, we serve alcohol and we serve, wine and beer and things like that, right? And then most of the tables would sit quiet, but one of the table would kind of get up and say, well, on our table or in, in our state, they could, provided it's Indian liquor. Another state would get up and say, no, provided it's foreign liquor. So it's really complicated for women to kind of, or for another example, right? If Brad's table said, hey, women in this room cannot work in marketing department, in fundraising department, things like that, simply because you are going to be going out there, meeting rich people, meeting, people outside of your homes, and that could put you in some kind of danger of sorts. And then again, one of the states would say something else, one of the states would say something else. So it's really like case by case, permission by permission. But what you're actually doing in the end is really giving the state the power to dictate what women can do and cannot do. So imagine I come from the northeast of India, right? If I were to operate in a particular industry of sorts, I would have to navigate this complex web of like 28 different states and what is permitted here, what is not permitted there. And so that's a complication that's the scale of complication that's there in India. So I don't know whether that helps answer your question, Jamie, but I'm just putting what the scene is as is right now in the country.
No, it does. And I have so many reactions and follow-up questions to ask, so please do let me know if either of you have a comment you'd like to add at any point. But I'm listening to you talk, thinking about how, I think interesting is the right word. It is that these policies seem to emerge in so many different societies and so many different cultures. These exact protectionist policies you are describing to prevent women from working at night, to prevent them from working in arduous occupations. These are policies that formed the foundation of a lot of labor law in the United States. Yep. There the arduous job was working on the railroad, so women were denied the ability to work on the railroad and in mines, and those kind of mining regulations still exist in countries around the world. So I think some of these policies, when you consider them in isolation, and I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think these are serious limitations. Yeah. But you could imagine someone thinking, what's the big deal if women can't work after
Absolutely.
8 p.m. at night? Why is this such a problem, these limitations on the ability to contract?
No, that's exactly what most of women-centric organizations in India kind of agree with, right? These are protections. We do require these protections. India is a dangerous country to be in. Our crime rates are high, our rape rates are high, and things like that. But I think fundamentally, imagine men in this room can work 24/7, right? Which means their earning capacity would be 24/7 into X amount, right? But what you're saying to the rest of us is saying, no, you can only work for 12 hours, X amount of days, and X amount of, and then multiply that with the amount that you can actually earn for yourself, right? So really putting a cap in terms of your earning, these dangers or these dangers that we need protection from require a very different set of solutions. The solution is not to clamp down on our freedoms. The solution is not to clamp down on our opportunities, right? They are there, they are evidently there in the country, and we need to find better solutions than restrictions. I think, how do we open up the economy for women as well as keep them protected? It's not an or it's like, and how do we do this? How do we get this done, right? And I think that's where we really come from, is like, even my parents would say, that's a great thing that the government is doing. But working in this sector, having, understanding where do freedoms get curbed and how do freedoms get curbed, not just for women, it could be for so many different kinds of groups, right? There are so many tribal groups in India, things like that. But I think give us a level playing field. That's all we're asking for. And I think that's a very important statement to make and ask for and demand for, right, from your governments.
Yeah. Thank you. Isabella, let's talk a little bit about some of your work. What have you seen as some of the most significant barriers to women's progress, to women's rights in your work?
Okay, talking about this specifically about Brazil, two things I would address as the worst thing that make women a step behind: violence and poverty. Brazil is one of the most violent countries in the world to be a woman. Our rape rates are high, our domestic violence rates are high, and this is the kind of problem which the solution is very difficult to find. How do we turn it low, the number of domestic violence or rape? How do you do that? And a second thing is poverty. Women in Brazil cannot have an easy access for menstrual products, especially when they are very young and they cannot work to get them. So they miss school a lot because they lack access for this kind of goods. And birth control. So women in Brazil, if they are very poor, they are in an eternal loop because they don't have access to birth control. They don't want to get pregnant, but then they get pregnant. And then once they're pregnant, they cannot interrupt the pregnancy because abortion in Brazil is not even illegal, it's a crime. So we can go to jail. And then we have another issue. In Brazil, to get your tubes tied, you need to follow a normal set of requirements. You need to be at least 25, you need to have at least 2 alive children. So it doesn't matter if you had 2 pregnancies, you need to have 2 alive children. And which is the worst, if you're married, you need to have your husband consentment. So if you want to start your tubes legally in Brazil, it's very hard. And if you get pregnant, you cannot interrupt the pregnancy. So if you are poor, you are in this eternal loop that you cannot go out. So these are the main things preventing women of progressing in Brazil. That's what I would say.
Where does the support for these very controlling reproductive health measures come from?
Well, from the government. So it is a law from a dictatorship time that we have in Brazil, and in the middle of the last century. So it was when they started, it was a very conservative dictatorship, and they thought that they were doing something good because they didn't want women to have premature sterilization.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this issue because I think so often in reproductive health it touches on so many controversial issues that we fall into this trap of debating what it is that women should do rather than whether or not government has an appropriate role in intervening and establishing the terms on which these decisions should be made. I know Lola is an international organization that works with women around the world, and they're doing a lot to try to bring different voices into this conversation and other kinds of conversations. How do you go about changing that dialogue when it seems something so entrenched, not just in this, but in all other policy areas, to want to focus on the activity rather than the policy?
Well, Lola, as you said, Lola is international, so we support women in different ways. So it depends on the leadership, how they want to address different problems across the globe. We are in India, we are in Mexico, we are in Brazil. So they find the kind of issue they want to address and they follow with it. In Brazil, for instance, we notice that we have that law. Who is going to change that law? Who is really deeply interested on changing that law? They are women. And then we started in Brazil, as our chapter was pretty much social, reading books together. But we're very passionate. We're Brazilians, so we wanted to become more political. So we started last year. Some of our members, organically, they started. They had an idea of running for office. So 13 of our members they were running for office. We had 6 elected, and now it's an ongoing project in Brazil. We are training women to become a part of the government, to change, to have liberty-minded policies to help with it. Like, this is our main thing now, is to change this specific barrier. We know that women are we are the responsible 100% for the cons of reproduction. So men, they have the nice part of reproduction. We had the whole bad part of the reproduction process. So we're trying to it is our decision at the end of the day. We're gonna get the best part and the worst part together. So we cannot separate them. And then it needs to be our choice. Because at the end of the day, we are the ones prevented by getting a new job when we are pregnant or when we have many children. We are the ones fired sometimes because we had and then we are the ones also to leave the job, because sometimes having a pregnancy, we want to, especially if you want to put your emotion there, if you're very involved, and that's okay, and then you want to leave, but that's your choice. And then we're working in Brazil to make it part of our choice. If you want to tie your tubes and you were 20, that's completely up to you. It should be an individual choice, not a government imposition.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's so much to follow up on there. I guess first, you've already talked about it a little bit, but just to really kind of bring the point home, can you expand a little bit on why exactly it is that reproductive rights connect into our economic freedom and economic opportunity?
Yes. If you get the data, if you are wealthy, you start to reproduce, to have baby later on, because you already have an education, you already have a profession, so you don't need to stop your whole life in order to have a baby. But when you're poor, you started before, because you didn't have access to birth control, for instance. You started before you finished college, before you were prepared for the job market. So it prevents you of getting a better job. If you get the data, women with the better jobs, they get married or even pregnant later on. They didn't get it very early on, which is not a problem if it is a choice. It's not a matter of judging or saying what's better. It's a matter of choosing by yourself and telling, I'm gonna have a family right now in my life, or I'm gonna have a family later on. Later on, I get my college degree. And so if you start a family without planning it, we were much more likely to have worse jobs and not that good opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in your work with Lola, either in Brazil or in the international organization, have you found a lot of women excited to step into these kind of roles? Are they reluctant to have the conversation? Do they face social pressure when it comes to kind of stepping into leadership and advocating for their freedom, either on this issue or on other issues? Can you speak a little bit? I guess what I'm trying to ask about is, if there are women out there who want to fight for their own freedom, what stops them?
Well, as I said, what is stopping them? First, what is preventing them of being there? Sometimes you cannot reach those places. Once you are there, the barriers are lower. Once you are there, the barriers are lower. The problem is getting there, especially in Brazil. What is really preventing them of getting there is poverty, as I said. And when we are there, we need to remember that we still face bad things in life, but that's adulthood. Everybody's gonna face bad things in life, but you need to be empowered enough to say no and to leave. So if you were facing sexual harassment or sexual assault on your job place or any kind of aggression, and you were empowered enough to say no, or to report, or to follow the right situation. So if they are empowered enough, they're gonna find it. They're gonna find it by themselves. But if they're not even going to get there.
Yeah, no is a beautiful word.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, property rights is, no, this is mine. You can't have it. And women's rights is being able to say, no, you don't make that choice for me, I make it for myself. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I love that point. Fatima, let's talk a little bit about what you're working on. What issues have you seen to be the most significant in terms of impeding women's economic freedom in Mexico?
Yeah, well, thanks. And here I'm going to build a little bit up from what Isabella said. So in Mexico, perhaps the main barrier that we see from the economic and the labor market perspective is unpaid care work. Women are we have the main role in care. On average, a Mexican woman adds 2.5 more time to caregiving. And that average increases considerably for married women and women that have kids, especially small kids. I am a mother of 3, and you understand how even when you get into the labor market and you start growing, it is a double burden. And not only that, like you see huge differences. For each male caregiver that you have in Mexico, we have 12 women. So the differences are considerably, and this mostly explains why we have a gender pay gap, because women are not getting into the highest rank positions in the private sector, in the public sector, and mostly it creates a vicious circle, right? Where women earn less, so the rational choice for a household is that if somebody has to stop working, it's going to be a woman, right? And so this becomes even more difficult. And the problem is that we don't have, in a difference from Brazil or India, we don't have legal restrictions that are impeding women to work, but we have a much more cultural environment in which even women say that would be their first role. So it takes more time for them to keep on working and growing within the labor market. And we also have policies that are signaling or reinforcing these ideas. Let's talk about the maternity leave. In Mexico, we have a 12-week maternity leave that's actually paid by the government, whereas men have a 5-day permit. There's not only a huge difference in time that screams to the world that moms have to take care of these new tasks for a newborn or a new adopted kid, but it also the strength of the policy because men have permits. That means that the government doesn't pay for that. Every firm has to give them these new dads 5 days off, paid by themselves. So incentives are not aligned in that sense. So basically, I mean, we still have the problem of the poverty and problems of safety, but unpaid work is the key for many, many problems in the labor market.
I'm glad you brought up this issue of the fact that when it comes to cultural beliefs that reinforce these limitations on political rights and economic rights, that it's often women who hold those beliefs as well as men. I think sometimes there's a view that to advocate for women's freedom means you're trying to pit the genders against each other in some sense, but usually it's the entire culture that holds a particular set of beliefs.
Yeah, and the truth is you want to do a new balance of it within the household, and that's somehow something that we're trying to push. This is not in Mexico. The women economic participation rate hasn't changed that much in the last 15 years. In 2005, we had 41% women were in the labor market or being economic active. That number went up to 45% in 2019, and then we saw a huge drop with the pandemic, going back to 41%. We are recovering until 43%. But the truth is that this is not going to change. What the pandemic did, it made very evident that women are the main caregivers, and that if households do not find a new arrangements and firms are flexible enough to capture women's talent, understanding that right now they have the primary caregiving role, it is very difficult to see a huge increase in that women or female economic rate.
So if all of us up here are onto something and thinking that it's not so great for a society to deliberately erect barriers to women participating in the workforce, then why do they keep happening? So in places like Mexico, where there are these gains that businesses can have by bringing in women to work, if families can improve their economic circumstances, what are the barriers? What are the political barriers or the beliefs that wind up preventing people from taking advantage of those gains?
I think right now, as the situation is, or the equilibrium that we have as a society, it is very difficult. Women do not want to have a double burden, and that's true because it's exhausting, and not you have to have like your wage and your income has to be enough so that you can that you want to keep on competing in the labor market, or your need has to be large enough so that you can balance both. But the truth is that's something that's not helping either women or the society, because there are gains for more male to be involved in that kind of tasks. And that's looking at the household. And there are policies that could help with that so that we can give this push to have a new equilibrium. But on the firm side and on the work side, because this is not only for firms, but also for the public sector, we are looking at adding more women as a social responsibility thing, and that's not it. At IMCO, we have estimated that our GDP would be 15% higher in 2030 if we add around 8 million women into, or we get them into the labor force. So that's a huge increase. There are economic benefits to having more diversity. There are market opportunities for innovation. Adding diversity into problem solving helps at many different levels, not only for women to get economic autonomy, but also to have an economy and firms that are more that can thrive, actually. So we have to stop looking at this as a social responsibility problem, but more of identifying all the economic gains that different levels could have if we add more women into the economy.
One thing I keep thinking about as I'm listening to all of you speak is the question of immigration. So there are countries where women or married women need permission to open a bank account, or they need permission to cross international borders. So there are deliberate attempts to prevent women from moving to places where they might have different labor market opportunities, where they might have more ways to deal with this dual burden, where they might be able to exit a social environment that they're not happy with. Can either of you speak to either this question of immigration or other international policies that we should be focusing on and thinking about as part of the women's rights agenda?
Okay, I want to quote Hamilton now for those who like the musical Immigrants, We Get the Job Done. Have you ever seen it? But, well, bringing more labor, well, it is the kind of thing that we can address to what's happening in the U.S. right now. We are lacking, we don't have enough workers right now in the U.S. We were lacking some, in many places we see help needed in many places, while we have people in the border trying to come. Like, this is, for me, making it easier is like what made this country great in the past. I guess immigration was what made this country great. And I think if you think like countries where immigrants goes are basically countries getting wealthier.
Well, I come from a country where majority of the women in labor force, right, is in the informal economy. So I really won't have much to say about the larger immigration story, so much as the horrific scenes you guys have must seen during the COVID times of migration of labor force, right, from one state to the other. So it's not just in terms of economic loss, it's huge social loss as well. It's like you are really moving your life. It's not just about the income that you get, you get in a particular state versus your own home country, but it's also a complete change in your life, a complete change in your children's education in terms of, so there are so many different aspects to the migration problem, right, in terms of, and which we saw evidently during the COVID times. And I think what we really have to understand is for a country the scale of India, looking at the informality of our women's labor force participation is an extremely important thing to consider, because what keeps them informal again, Jamie, going back to the policy story again, right, is there are so many instances where entering the job market is illegal by law, and yet women do enter these professions. And what does that illegality kind of lead to? Is you don't get the kind of wages that men get for an equal scale and scope of work, right? You are always harassed, you're open to harassment, and so the problem is multidimensional. It's not always about economic gains, it's also about social gains, about life gains, right? And I think that's what I feel is very dynamic about the situation that's probably true for India, but probably also for Brazil and probably also for some of the other countries, right?
Yeah. The fact that there are so many organizations paying attention to these issues and doing work on them now really gives me a lot of hope. We have talked about a fair number of barriers and harmful policies, so I do want to try to end on a little bit of a note of moving forward here. So I'd like to hear from each of you kind of as we conclude in our last 5 minutes here. What should all of us in the room here today or listening to this panel, what can we walk out of here and do to work towards women's economic rights, to work towards women's political rights, and to work towards expanding freedom for women in general?
I would probably say that there are a lot of things that we can do from our own households, beginning there. Talent is diverse, and we wanna have that talent despite the personal characteristic of each person. So, and that means probably if me as a mother, you raise your kids differently, and I treat my colleagues in the office a little different, reminding that they are persons first than workers. So probably there's a lot of changes that we can do right now, and that they can translate into different changes so that we can make a more flexible and a more open environment. And that could eventually translate into policies we have to understand all the gains that we get from diversity. So,
thank you. Isabella?
Well, what I would say is, I will address my answer for the job market. I think we should treat women like as professionals. We should definitely treat them with respect. We should definitely avoid inappropriate talks in the job market, inappropriate behaviors, and especially taking a no seriously. This is something that we should definitely do, and if we want to prevent our movement of very unpleasant situations, we should make this job market much more attractive to women and in a safe place.
Well, for me and for Trias, I think working on women's issues, right, what we realize is this is a really powerful issue to work on that really brings the left and the right and the front and the back together, right? There is no fight in terms of ideas. You're not fighting at an ideas level. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. Every country wants better economic opportunities for women. Everybody is working in that space, right? And so for me, this opportunity that there is for us to unite opposing viewpoints, to unite different sets of groups together, right, for a very common cause that you want to propel. I think that's been something that I'm really excited about, and something that I hope will open up a whole gamut of partners, a whole gamut of individuals to kind of come together, embrace, and work towards that. So that's largely on a country-specific level, right? Within our organizations, and I think I spoke to you briefly about this, Jamie, during our virtual catch-up. It's also, and I'll bring this, the statistics maybe is the right platform to do that. Like even within our movement, right? I was referring to how 21% of some 500 Atlas partners are led by women. I think even lesser are women founded. And therefore, it's not that we want special provisions, it's not that we want special opportunities of sorts, but give us that level playing field. Women's needs are slightly different than men's needs. Identify what those needs are, right? And not just talk about what those needs are, but really action and really help them succeed in the roles that they aspire to.
Yeah,
I think
having
that seat on the table, having that leadership seat on the table is extremely, extremely important. And I keep going back to some of the, the references of the different committees that make this policy and that policy and things like that. And I see that pretty much 95% of these committee members making decisions about women's rights are male dominated. You barely see 2 or 3 women in some of those committees, right? So it's really important to have that seat on the table.
Thank you so much. And one thing that I want to highlight about these answers is that they point out that there is action we can take from the bottom up. Eleanor Ostrom, the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, pointed out to us that systemic change is something that needs to take place at all levels, including in our families, communities, and these organizations. So before we applaud our panelists, I'd like to invite you to join some of the breakout sessions that begin at 2:30 p.m. Storytelling and Messaging in Americana Ballroom Salon 2. Regional Deep Dive, US and Canada in Americana Ballroom Salon 1. And Big Tech, Free Speech and Censorship, the Classical Liberal Response in Poinciana 1 and 2. And thank you so much for this fascinating conversation this afternoon. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.